The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to the IWFM webinar series, essentially tackling navigating turbulent times. So this is our first episode of our brand new series, and we will ensure there's going to be fortnightly episodes with expert guests, which you'll hear from free today. So the aim of the webinars is essentially to delve into today's greatest challenges, tackle your questions and concerns, which we will tackle in this webinar today, and help our profession navigate through this difficult period. So our first episode in the series is obviously COVID-19 and rising to the challenge. A very difficult period for everyone, particularly in the UK and globally. In terms of workplace and FM managers, no doubt have an essential role to play during and after the pandemic. But with uncertainty rife, which we're all experiencing, and so much information circulating as well, it can be very difficult to know what steps to take next. So hopefully through this webinar and this series in particular, this episode, we're going to tackle on two topics that you're going to hear from our expert speakers today. One about strengthening your contingency plans and supporting your organisations in the midterm, moving away from reactivity and towards measured and planned responses. So that's one aspect we're going to tackle today. And as well as facilities management and the professionals in particular being recognised by government as key workers. So today's webinar will be going into those points, as well as getting opportunity for you to raise questions and concerns throughout the webinar. So I encourage you to use the question function on the software, as well as in terms of the actual webinar itself. It will be recorded, so this can be cascaded to colleagues as well for those that can actually attend the webinar live today. So in terms of your host for this webinar, my name's Peter Brogan, Head of Research and Insight here at the IWFM. Very simply put, 3 bullet points. It seems oversimple in terms of what my team has to do at the Institute, but essentially producing first-class research and insight, supporting workplace and FM professionals through methodologies such as webinars and other methodologies, and also developing insight content and guidance. And probably the best way of describing that is currently on our Insight page, that you will see a plethora of information right through from good practice guides, research reports, guidance notes, and the majority of that is accessible free for members as well as non-members. The good practice guides is a member offer only, but there is a small charge for those guides. But just a visual representation when we say research and information and guidance. Talking about research and information guidance as an institute, and as two of the speakers on this webinar have been keen to support and have supported this particular resource on COVID-19. This is available on our website. There are regular updates on this resource, and hasten to add, as I've mentioned, the 3 speakers today have been pivotal in developing that content on this website, on our website. So as promised, the speakers that we've got today are Dave Cook, Resilience Business Continuity and Crisis Management Consultant, and he's also the chair of our Risk and Business Continuity SIG. Following Dave, we'll have John Newsom, Facilities Management Consultant, IWFM Risk Management and Business Continuity SIG Deputy Chair, so another member of our SIG, and also our very own Sophie Hooper, Head of Policy IWFM, who will be delving deeper into the key worker debate, and we would encourage your views in terms of that, and encourage your views on all the speakers' thoughts today. So before I hand over to Dave, I'll just give a little bit of background around Dave in terms of his experience and who's actually speaking to you today. Dave is an independent consultant specialising in resilience, business continuity and crisis management. As already mentioned, chairs our very own risk and business continuity SIG. Not only that, Dave has spent over 30 years working for the BBC's International News Division and headed their FM function before specialising in security, business continuity and risk management. Also, he was head of business continuity and risk management for BBC Global News, responsible for responsibilities for maintaining staff safety and programme output in their multimedia news operations in the UK and over 90 countries around the world. More recently, Dave has been working with clients across industry sectors to help them respond effectively to the coronavirus pandemic and adapt their continuity plans to meet the current challenges. Not only that, within his busy schedule, Dave is a fellow of the IWFM and also a member of the Business Continuity Institute and holds board certifications in business continuity and security. Dave is also a member of the British Standard Institute's Continuity and Resilience Committee, board member of the UK Security Commonwealth. So the IWFM are very lucky to have Dave as our chair of our Risk Business Continuity SIG. And I will now pass over to Dave to go through his presentation.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Just by way of introduction, I mean, time is not going to allow us to produce a sort of definitive view and guide for all things FM in the current emergency. So what we really want to do is to look at some of the key emerging issues, learning from organisations who we've been speaking to, but also to think about what next and what people should be thinking, building into their planning at this stage. So I wonder, by way of introduction, we'll do a quick online poll just to get some sense of where people think they are in their current planning. If you could respond quickly, we'll get a feel for the audience generally and your take on your preparedness to deal with the next 3 months. So we'll just pause while people press their buttons and we should get a pretty instantaneous view. Be as honest as you can. It's all completely anonymous and we just want to get a feel really of where you all are or where you think you are. Okay, so you can all see that, good feedback, reassuring in many respects, in that the great majority feel that they're reasonably well prepared or have some work to do. So that's a good test of where we are now, and it'd be interesting to see whether the points that we cover in today's presentations shift that in any way and help you identify there are other things that you might be doing to make yourself even better prepared for what's ahead. So what we're going to look at is business continuity planning, the sort of processes, what you might be doing. Many of you will be well on the way in terms of having plans in place, implemented and maintaining those, but it's really where do we go from here? We'll look at some of the emerging issues around security, both cyber and physical security, supply chain, and an area critical to the FM community, buildings and building occupation. And my colleague, John Newson, who will be following me, will go into some considerable depth looking at some of the emerging issues and what the current thinking is. So thinking about the role of the FM professional and recognising we have people from different disciplines on the call, different levels of experience, different levels of responsibility, the roles are considerably varied, and we want to try and cover as much ground as we can, and to make sure that everybody comes away with at least one nugget of information that will help them carry things forward. So the FMs, generally, you may be part of your company's crisis management team. In some cases, you may be leading it, but you all have your own specialist responsibilities for operations, compliance, and providing services to your customers in the current emergency. And that may feel very different to business as usual. You'll also often have responsibilities for links with the wider community, be that neighbours, local enforcement authorities, managing agents, etc. So really a pivotal point. So hopefully this presentation will cover some ground that is of interest and value to you. So bear with me if I can. Okay, that's go back one. Okay, so the challenges. Many organisations will have had continuity plans, but they will have often been focused around single events, short-term issues, and this really is an unprecedented situation in that continuity plans being stretched on all fronts in the senses of shortage of staff, possibly reduction in building occupancy, people working in very different ways, supply chains disrupted, and most of all, uncertainty and in many ways lack of control over what may happen going forward. In planning your responses, clearly intelligence, getting the right information is key. And you don't have to look too far on news feeds to see how much misinformation there is going around at the moment. So choosing your sources of information is critical, as is trying to limit the amount of information that is actually flowing across your desk to that which is key. So one of the things we're trying to do with the resources on the IWFM website that Peter mentioned is to provide some links to what are reliable reliable source of information which have been kept up to date. So please do check in on that, and we'll mention one or two as we go through the presentations today. For many organisations, it is business as usual, or as usual as business can be in the current climate. For others, it is very much a disrupted, or in some cases shut down, business activity that facilities managers and people in the facilities profession are trying to support and maintain critical services. Similarly, communication, absolutely critical in times of crisis, in keeping our staff informed, motivated, keeping customers informed, keeping our supply chain fully engaged. So it's clear we have to work much harder at communication, albeit that it's more challenging, with people often routines disrupted, lack of face-to-face communication, and I think it's surprising how much we all pick up in our day-to-day work just from being close to colleagues, hearing what's going on, and that providing this bedrock of information in day-to-day activities. So we have to replace that and have to establish new routines when people are often concerned and working in very different ways. So we'll touch a little bit more on that as we go through the presentation. And thinking about some of the unexpected impacts of our plans. Home working is a good example, working effectively at length, but it may well introduce some additional security risks and challenges, in addition to some issues around staff welfare and well-being. And of course, in the facilities world, we're always used to managing risks. And while the focus has shifted to some of the new risks and challenges that we're facing, the great majority of the old risks are still there. And there is a danger, of course, that in moving our eye onto the current ball of challenges, we miss something and we have some issues or problems arising from those. So making sure that we're still on the ball with those routines and managing risks effectively, again, is key. But at the heart of it, we need flexibility because we don't know what's coming around the corner. We're all learning in terms of new ways of working in almost a new community with services provided differently. So we need to be flexible and resilient because we're certainly in it for the longer term. So if we look at planning, first of all, as I said earlier on, the great majority of people will have implemented plans, will be dealing with the challenges that face them. But they'll need to change, either as a result of the changing environment, constraints that are being placed on us by government or by changes in our supply chain. And we'll need to adapt to perhaps the longer term and seeing how our plans and processes stand up as the days and weeks go by. So how do you actually judge what will happen next? Many of you will be familiar with the concept of scenario planning, but for those who don't, it's a good way of actually laying out the sort of challenges that you may face in the future, and getting some key people together in your organisation, people you work with, people from different disciplines, and just saying, what if, what might happen, and try to be as radical as you can be with that, because if we rolled ourselves back 3 or 4 months, who would have thought we'd be sitting here having this conversation now in the environment we're all working in? So be radical. What happens if the current constraints arrangements go on for a month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months? What happens if the government decides that the current arrangements are not having the impact they want, and more services or more businesses are closed, more constraints placed upon people generally in the community and on businesses specifically? So look at those scenarios and say, how would that impact our business? How would we respond? And think about, what is it we might have missed? What really might happen? And also, I've mentioned the longer term. We're sitting here in a period where things are, or feel that we're on a sort of a routine now, and people are working, businesses are carrying on. But is this arrangement sustainable for weeks or months, or will that very situation bring pressures onto our plans that we'll have to manage in a different way? So turning to the additional challenges the situation we're in may bring, reduced occupation or building closure is one area that we're seeing people taking action. Well-being of staff. Clearly, people are working in a very different way, in a very different environment, and working at home. Not everybody has a family around them. They may be feeling anxious, stressed by the current situation, concerned about their job. So their well-being and mental health is something that should be, uppermost in our minds. And certainly communication is going to play an absolutely key role in trying to keep people engaged, keep them motivated, but we will have to work at that and work quite hard at it. Does your company have an employee assistance program that you might want to point your staff at if they're feeling stressed or they have particular problems? Maintaining the supply chain is something that is absolutely critical, and we'll have a look at that in a little bit of depth, both in terms of in the current emergency, but when we come to a point where we are starting to return to normal. And security we've touched upon, and we will look at it in a little bit more depth, and the economic pressures in the longer term. Your company, how stable is that? Are things likely to change in terms of what's expected of you in service provision as a result of financial pressures? Or will it impact your supply chain? Will suppliers who are currently delivering, albeit in challenging times, will they be able to continue to do that? So turning to security, and let's pause and consider occupation of premises, because both John and I talk to clients and we're seeing some changes in the way people are using premises and some consideration to closing premises. But let's do a very quick poll just to see if people on the call are actually making changes to the premises that they occupy. So again, please participate. Let's just get a sense of what's going on in the wider community. And it could well be your business is thinking about this, or you as the the facilities professionals in your organisation may well be thinking about this or thinking about the impact. And we'll spend a little bit of time in the presentation looking at the detail of that. Okay, so that actually is very interesting. With over 90% of people having made a change to their occupation, and a third having actually closed buildings or their building. So that is quite a vivid picture of what's going on out there. So thank you for that. And I think some of the information we're covering and will cover will be particularly pertinent. So stepping through this and conscious of time, clearly if you've got a reduced occupation or a change in occupation or closed premises, you need to update your risk assessments, and not just the risk assessments for security, but for fire precautions, for the health and safety considerations for the premises, and be as diligent as you can in that, recognising there will still be a number of unknowns. And in the physical world, physical security of premises that are unoccupied or reduced occupation, the basic tenets of good security process with a layered approach obviously still apply. What may be slightly unusual is that part of our monitoring arrangements often relies on our own staff reporting things that arouse their suspicion. So actually, having lost that, we may need to implement more in terms of monitoring, either through equipment or through increased security patrols. And think about our response if we do have problems. So, are you informing the police locally, your security guarding company? Are key holding lists up to date with second points of contact if needed? Have a look at all of that. And tell neighbours as well. You work in a community, engage that community in helping look after each other and look after each other's premises if properties are left unoccupied. Do tell your insurers what's going on. If there's a change in your normal occupation, you'll be well served in talking to them, informing them to prevent any downstream problems. And insider threats, it seems a bit strange to talk about insider threats in this context, but there may be staff, sad though it is to say it, who will want to take advantage of reduced occupation, perhaps reduced security arrangements, to take advantage for their own benefit. There may also be disgruntled employees who've been furloughed, who don't feel they've been treated fairly, who may take action. I think all of that is very much a minor part of the overall picture, but worth bearing in mind. And when we come to cyber security, not historically the domain of the facilities professional, but we have responsibilities, and you will have a close liaison hopefully with your IT and cyber security teams where your organisations have those. But certainly we're seeing a large increase in coronavirus-related phishing attacks and scams. Been a lot of publicity about that. And there's some very good guidance on the National Cybersecurity Centre web pages and CPNI web pages on dealing with that. But it's clear that with having a large number of people working at home in a strange environment, that there are additional security threats there. And I think we need to think about security awareness training or refreshers for our staff. There may be inexperienced users handling confidential or sensitive material in a home environment where other people are around and the normal security controls and protocols just don't exist. Kit may be vulnerable to theft or damage. There are a variety of new threats arising from people working at home where essentially that's not normal routine. Bear with me, I'm having a problem moving on with the slide. Okay, supply chain. It's clear supply chains are under pressure. There's absolutely no doubt about that. You will have a good handle on what your current suppliers are able to do and what they're not able to do. But if ever there was a time for regular, open and honest communication with suppliers, now is the time. Because we really do need to have a true sense of where they are and what they think is going to happen. We need to get beneath the veneer of everything's fine, we're working in difficult circumstances, but we'll be there for you, to really understand where they are, understand their vulnerabilities and understand the dependencies in their supply chain. Now, we can't do that for all of our suppliers, I'm quite sure, but to pick out those that are critical to your business survival and spend some time now working with them is absolutely essential. And think about what if the worst happens? What if the suppliers, the key suppliers who are saying everything is fine, fall by the wayside? Have we really got a workable plan that is ready to go with a supplier who is ready to go to sit in behind them? What happens if there are multiple supplier problems? A lot of our planning generally has focused on just one key supplier failure. But what if we have multiple supplier problems? Build these issues into your scenario planning. And when we come to a return to normal, will that transition be smooth when there may well be very high customer demand at the same time? And John, I think we'll explore that a bit more in building building services terms. So just finally now from me, the key points. Think about what next. We've got a bit of breathing space, and while the news this morning generally was upbeat, both in the UK and beyond, it's very early days, and we shouldn't be going, oh well, things are only going to get better. We need to be thinking about the scenarios of them going on or possibly getting worse. That's our responsibility in terms of effective planning. We've got to keep this communication going. Communicate, 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 both with staff, your stakeholders, your suppliers, your customers. Be honest and open, build that trust so people do rely on what you're saying. Keep up to date with new guidance. There's lots coming out all the time. IWFM website is a good place to go for that. Share your ideas and concerns. Network. If you want to get a sense of what's going on in the community, Business Continuity Institute have published the results of a survey looking where people are with the resilience planning. It's well worth a look. Be flexible, be prepared to change, and think about what normal will look like when we return to it. Things I suspect won't be exactly as we see them before the emergency. And focus on the well-being of staff. We're nothing without our staff, and staff are going to be tested further, I fear, before we return to normal. And look after yourselves too in that situation. Now, in all of this, please, we do want your questions. We do want to know what your challenges are. Pop them in on the question section of the webinar tool. and we'll do our best to answer those at the end. So I'll hand back to Peter now. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Dave. And yes, just to echo Dave's point, please put in the Q&A questions section, should I say, for our Q&A section in terms of some of what your biggest challenges are, as well as some of the questions you may have for Dave and our next speaker. So just very quickly, you might remember the picture of John, a bit of background about John before he proceeds with his part of his presentation. Again, a man with a wealth of experience within FM over 25 years. He's worked in the UK and internationally as a change manager, helping facilities organisations to transition through effective communication and stakeholder management. Also, as mentioned, John is Deputy Chair of our Risk and Business Continuity and being a pivotal figure on the COVID-19 resource that's currently on the IWFM website, which is updated regularly, if not daily. Also, John has recently worked with Oxford County Council to recover and redesign the facilities engineering and maintenance service. So been there, done that. And also he's currently, as mentioned, is applying his experience and thinking to the effects of COVID-19 pandemic and the challenges facing organisations, including the recovery phase. So we're lucky to have him. So John, if I could pass over to you, and hopefully the technology will allow me to do that fairly straightforward. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon. Starting with a slide which says everything has changed, but the fundamentals remain the same. So facilities management is really has been built for these sort of changes in organisations, challenges going through, and it's where facilities management could possibly shine as well. Taking it very simply, I see service as a process of matching requirements, so there's a need to understand exactly what those requirements are, and also to understand the environment in which we're working and delivering as well. As David's pointed out, I think many of the working practices and relationships supply chain have changed over the last, certainly after the last 3 weeks, if not month or two. And virtually every area has been impacted. I mean, what have we got? We've got 97% of the responders to that question have actually reduced occupation or indeed have buildings closed in the last month or so. So very significant changes going on. So the objective here in this sort of this part of the presentation is to explore those particular challenges and signpost some resources that you may find useful going forward. And these resources are updated, and I think that's one of the things that comes out from Dave's presentation, is that things are unlikely to remain the same. They're going to change, and we need to be prepared for those changes. There's been a lot of confusion, I think, over what organisations can work, and I think Sophie's going to touch on some elements of that. But the language from the government has been misinterpreted, generally in the press and in the public as well. But they're quite clear on the websites. When they were talking about non-essential retail and places where the public visits or congregates closing, the government did not require any other businesses to close. Indeed, it was important to keep other business open and carry on. But how that is applied and the definitions of what is essential, what are key workers, etc. These are the challenges that are now being sorted out or trying to be sorted out when already quite a lot of business is actually closed. And that not only goes for the supply chain, but also goes for some of the regulatory authorities as well. You'll have seen something that's trailed that MOTs have had a 6-month extension if they expire in the period of the COVID crisis. And whilst the MOTs have been extended, the responsibility for having a car fit for the highway is still your responsibility. So it's as if the policing light has been taken away from vehicular transport, of car transport, and you need to take on that responsibility yourself. And that's not really too much different with the likes of the HSE. The HSE on their website say our regulatory approach will take a flexible and proportionate account of the risks and challenges arising from the pandemic. So whilst there would appear to be a glimmer of light that they would be somewhat sympathetic to the challenges that we've got, they're also at pains to point out that the statutory duty holder still has all their still holds the responsibilities. So really, it's a passing of those responsibilities down the line to those that run the buildings or those that run the businesses. We look at lift inspections, which I expect is maybe one query lying around. I looked at Zurich, and Zurich are talking about they got together with Suffolk and the HSE and started finding out what they could actually do. And they are at pains to point out as well that the HSE are not currently issuing any exemptions or relaxing any requirements of the relevant regulations to lifts. And Zurich themselves have got a challenge, as many businesses have, with staff and with travel. And they are concentrating their efforts around lifts and lift inspections, of course, around hospitals and the health estate. But they also have in their list socially, economically vital sites, services, construction, large employers, and essential commerce, including the government, local government hubs, and banking. So they have, if you like, cut back their service to what they consider to be the essential areas of business, whilst the government is saying that all business is open. So it's kind of, it doesn't sit well together. But there are ways through that. I mean, thorough examinations of lifts are not only the preserve of insurance companies, but you might look at your maintainers as well to provide you with that service after discussions with the insurance company, of course. There'll be a shortage of qualified resource at the end of all of this, for sure. I can imagine the challenges of trying to find a gas service engineer in September going into winter with all the pent-up summer works not being able to be delivered. There'll be challenges there for sure. And the supply chain challenges, as I mentioned before, the staff shortage that we have. Many sectors are talking about something like 20% of their staff self-isolating, and that may go to some of the reduced occupancy, 35% in the survey that said that it was reduced occupancy in their buildings because a number of staff are self-isolating, or they've got childcare issues as well. Vacant properties, what does that mean? Well, are properties truly vacant? I would suggest that probably they're not locked up and not looked at. In the facility centres, we could have security staff visiting on site. We could have skeleton staff or reduced staff. So I feel that it's really a change of mode of the properties rather than vacant properties. And I think some other areas other than FM might not understand that actually we do have activities to do, even though the building is shut. Summing up then, the rate of change is across multiple subject areas, and you can see that it is quite extreme. Looking to try and be proactive, well, there's an opportunity to perhaps bring some maintenance forward. So you could bring forward the boiler maintenance, say, and gas certification, making the annual gas certificate due at this time next year, which would be could be a way of getting over that resource problem at the end of the pandemic. And there are also things that you might do in buildings that you have problems in doing in buildings when they're fully occupied. Say asset collection in schools is one thing that's been mentioned. That might be an easier thing to do. And an empty building, quite frankly, is probably a very safe place to work at the moment. There's also administration tasks as well, running the gamut of scenario planning and all those sort of things, but also looking at procurement issues as well. So your suppliers and the likelihood of your suppliers coming out in the same format and same delivery format as we went into the lockdown. There's been a lot of talk about decommissioning and mothballing. I think they take the guidance from CIBSE Guide M on that. Decommissioning is sort of like the opposite side of the coin of commissioning, and that generally happens when a project or a system has been built and you want to put it into operation. It's quite an expensive thing to do, and likewise decommissioning and recommissioning is quite expensive to do. Decommissioning is really, I feel, something that happens at the end of the life of the building or of the system that's in. Mothballing is probably more appropriate, and one could equate that to hibernation. In other words, systems working at a really low level without requiring too much resource to bring back into full life. They've mentioned risk assessments. And I think it's as well to look at what risk assessments will be impacted by the reduced occupancy or some closed buildings. And also with probably a priority to look at life safety systems as well in that process. Often you'll be dealing with designs that are actually don't allow for partial occupation, so there may well be some innovation required there to adjust the systems to suit the circumstances of reduced occupation. So revisit the risk assessments, certainly. Work out what systems are required. Draining down, that's one of the things that was mentioned before, a form of decommissioning, if you like. And I know it's been recommended by some insurance companies, but that in itself delivers a heavy requirement for chlorination and recommissioning systems afterwards, and partially drained down, because you can never get all the water out. Partially drained down systems also lead to some internal corrosion issues as well. So I think hibernation is a better route to go by, and that may increase the flushing and requirements as well. And the flushing requirements is a sort of not a skilled exercise, and could be done by resource that you may already have on site, as Dave was pointing out, some security elements or whatever. So, but that will all come out in your water risk assessment revisit. Are there any set points that can be changed? Obviously, set points, time clocks. What other parameters might be changed to reflect the new mode of the property? When we talk about water tank capacity in those buildings that have less occupation, and perhaps as a way of reducing the amount of water in those tanks by sensors or adjusting sensors, and looking to increase the water turnover, and so reducing the risk of Legionella. And do you need 4 operational lifts in your building? Is there an opportunity to mothball 2 and then reduce the requirement for maintenance and reduce the need for resources? All of these things are possible, but need a lot of conversation with your supply chain. One of the things, taking the next two really, 2 points together, we've got BMSs. BMSs are great for multiple locations and looking at sensors and those sort of things. But in buildings that are shut down, you're probably better at actually visiting the plant rooms themselves. There's a rich picture to be drawn with sight, smell, vibrations, sound, ambient temperatures, surface temperatures, all these sort of things that generally BMSs do not allow you to do to gauge the condition of issues developing in plant rooms or in equipment rooms. So I thoroughly recommend that these places are visited and not just assumed to be closed down and safe. And the supply chain. So who are you going to call? Have all the numbers been tested? All the telephone numbers been tested? Do you have an escalation plan with the suppliers? Are you in regular contact with the supply chain? Do you know the arrangements for supplies or spares? And do you know their stock holding? These are all the things that in Dave's presentation he's talking about, understanding exactly what the supplier's position is. So there's a degree of sharing that's required there that will strengthen your planning with regard to your properties in the estate. And finally, I think anticipate the business as usual, returning to the business as usual. Begin with that end in mind. Anything you do in this period, you're going to need to reverse or turn back the clock and put it back into operation. So have a mind to that whilst you're going through these planning scenarios. So that was the what, why, and when. Now turning to the how. Well, insurance companies certainly are need to be consulted, and because you'll need to maintain cover or maintain their sort of issues. But I think along the lines of the HSE, etc., they will be reasonable in these times as to what is practical and what can be done. HSE obviously keep up to date for the statutory position, and CIBSE have a knowledge base page of COVID-19 as well. The biggest resource that I found out there is the BESA, Building Engineering Service Association. They are known for SFG 20, which is a good starting point for any maintenance schedule, but they have a comprehensive hard services source. Trail back in October last year, they were developing a new version of SFG 30 and published it at the beginning of March. When I phoned and spoke to them the other day, they were kind of inundated really. SFG 30 is mothballing and reactivation specification. They're offering it to SFG 20 subscribers and others for £250. But if you're a BESA member, you're automatically entitled to it. They've mixed up, in reading some of the stuff, they mixed up some of the mothballing and decommissioning in parts, but SFG 20 and FSG 30 are never something to be sort of used wholesale. They do need a degree of interpretation. Like I say, they're a good place to start, and they will cover off the compliance issues as well. And if you look across in the they're talking about what you need to do. In other words, what the maintenance needs to deliver, and that's statutory compliance, property security, building fabric, business critical information. So you can find it there on that website, and I thoroughly recommend that to you. One of the things that there's an awful lot of information on their website, which is the other side of the paywall, on the accessible side of the paywall, and that's the PDF presentation of SFG 30 and 20 and 30, and I thoroughly recommend giving that a read. I see what you mean, Dave. You press and nothing happens.
Thank you, John. That's great. I think from that point of view,
we're not quite there yet.
I'm just aware of time, though, John. We're now 10 to. So
I've got one more. I've got one more slide. I've got one more slide to wrap it up. Okay. So yeah, it's a service and the requirements, and it's needed to understand what those requirements are, and you need to stay connected. So stay connected with the supply chain, stay connected with the external and internal customers, your insurance companies, the HSC, those that are developing your RAMs and your operating procedures, and lastly, your staff. Now, Peter, you can have it.
Thank you, John, and apologies, jumped in there a little bit too soon on your last slide, but I am aware of time and I'm very keen to get to the questions that have been firing in as both respectively John and Dave have been going through their presentations. But we've got next up Sophie Hooper, who I have the pleasure of working with very closely at the Institute, who's head of policy, who looks after our wider policy and public affairs work, helping to raise the voice of the Institute's members and the wider workplace and FM sector. So Sophie's going to be talking about the key worker debate. So Sophie, hopefully again, technology will allow me to do this. If I click the right person would help. So over to Sophie.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. My contribution today will focus on the key worker debate, and I will just run through a quick timeline, the challenges and the actions we have been taking. So from key worker to critical function, we're not quite there yet. Everyone knows the saying, a week is a long time in politics, and it hasn't even been 3 weeks since the concept of a key worker was introduced on the 19th of March. So on the 23rd of March, we went into lockdown, and generally the guidance was please work from home where possible, which really meant that it was more important to get clarification on who really was that key worker. So that on the next day, IWFM sent a letter to ministers about key worker status, and that really FM professionals and their workers and supply chain should be included in that status. Then later on that week, we had an opportunity to join forces with other organisations within the wider built environment, including the BPF, ARMA, IRPM, RIF, to once again write to ministers calling for more clarity on the functions, really. As it's clear, it might be easier to focus on the list of functions that should be maintained in buildings, whether they're still operational or closed, than a list of people that should be carrying them out, especially because of all the different job descriptions, etc., that are out there. So while we've seen perceivably little progress over the last few weeks, last week the Infrastructure Projects Authority in the Cabinet Office became a sponsor for developing a more defined list, which we are expecting any time now. And I said it really is taking so long because it's difficult to decide really what critical and essential really is, as so much needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis, depending on the building. So what are really the challenges for workplace and FM officials? I think you're very well placed to know that, really. The lack of clarity who is a key worker and what this means for our profession. The lack of clarity in what are those critical functions that we should still be able to carry out. We've seen reports of clients that don't really think it's necessary to keep on paying for services that they deem as unnecessary or unused. And what we also see is that certain suppliers might be closed, so it's impossible to really deliver that service. And in addition, there appears to be some inconsistency in the advice and enforcement on statutory duties. So for example, in fire safety, different local fire and rescue services are responding to queries with slightly different advice. And we know from our engagement with the NFC, the National Fire Chiefs Council, that they are working on putting out consistent advice for the country. So in essence, what we've seen is that facilities professionals and workers can't really do their job because they might be refused travel or have some difficulties with travel. The access to building is an issue, and some anecdotal reports of abuse by the public have been reported within the wider industry. So really, what are we doing and why are we doing it? I think it's obvious that the actions we've been taking and the engagement we've been carrying out is to mitigate these challenges that have been outlined. And we just really want to raise awareness on what is needed to keep buildings and the users safe, even where it's perceived that the building is closed, because it will still need maintaining and certain services. So our actions have really focused on two audiences, or have two audiences in mind. One is the government and increasing their understanding, because if they give clearer advice on what then still is necessary and critical and seen as an essential building maintenance service, then hopefully that will give you and other members the greater clarity and something to refer to with clients and other stakeholders, including duty holders, that those services need to be maintained. So I've already mentioned that we've been writing to ministers, with the key message being that FM professionals and contractors should continue to be able to travel and attend their workplaces, and really that FMs are in the best possible position to make a decision about who should be on site and what activity is needed, because of that kind of case by case decision making need. Through our engagements, we obviously also pick up some information which we all deposit on our Corona resources webpage that Dave and John have already mentioned. So that continues to be updated as soon as we become aware of things, or when some of our stakeholders that we engage with update us on guidance. We've really been putting forward the profession's concerns into government, including into the construction leadership councils, who have a daily task force with ministers and high-ranking officials. We've been feeding into the list of critical functions that should be coming out this week. Also, very recently, we've published a travel to work template letter that you may want to use if you've got any staff that needs to continue to make its way, and that will become increasingly important if, following last weekend's reports, that people continue to go out. So if there is stricter enforcement on its way, that we give that tool to our members. And generally, we will continue to push best practice with stakeholders. So really, what is next for us as an organisation? We will continue to look out for that broad guidance about critical functions in commercial and residential property management, which should be published shortly. So keep an eye out for the website, because we will be putting it on there once it becomes available. And also, we will continue to work on more detailed building management guidance and share that with stakeholders such as the NFCC, so that they can use it to inform their own guidance. And then what's going to be really important as kind of a next stage, once the dust settles, if one can use that expression in this time, will be important to articulate the future challenges for the profession, because will organisations want to continue the same service from FM professionals? Will the footprint of workplaces be the same? There's a lot of people working from home now that might enjoy that remote working. Do they want to return to their physical workplace? And these are questions that we're beginning to tackle and that will also be raised in the, in the next webinar series. Sorry, had some technical difficulties there, but that is the last bit of mine, Peter.
No, thank you, Sophie, and appreciate that you've done a whistle-stop tour on that, on your part of the presentation today, and obviously the time. But and from that, Sophie's probably articulated exactly the work and what the good work that we will continue to do as an institute around in terms of how much we can raise the profile of the key work, as well as the key worker debate around FM. We have had a whole load of questions. Now, for those audience still on us, you're probably fully aware of the time, we're an hour in, but I am keen to take some questions. However, for those individuals that have raised questions, be rest assured that the questions will be passed on to our respective speakers and we will respond to your questions. The system does capture all the questions, so don't feel like it's a wasted effort if, apologies, we don't actually get through everyone's questions. So apologies for that, but be rest assured we will get back to you with the answers because it's all captured within the system. There's a particular question that's coming from Amanda, and I think it might be aimed at you, Dave, in particular around, should my business prepare a plan for all possible outcomes in the currently developing situation? So linking obviously to COVID-19.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a question of practicality versus making sure you're prepared for all eventualities. It's not possible to to produce detailed plans for all eventualities. We'd be doing that in a year's time. But I think going back to the point I was making about scenario planning and considering the impact, I think you can consider quite a significant number of potential outcomes or potential changes in the current situation, and think about the impact for your organisation and what you might do about it. And that can be done in a quite a pragmatic way quite quickly. And so I would encourage people to do that, to think about those eventualities, impact, response, rather than trying to produce detailed plans and documentation for every eventuality.
That's great, thank you, Dave. There's a question that's come in for you, Sophie, in respect to the key worker debate from a gentleman called Paul. So thank you, Paul, for sending this in. And I think there was an element on your last slide there about what next. So what, as an institute, are we doing next around the key worker debate? So maybe just elaborate on that, Sophie, if possible.
Well, we just continue to engage with stakeholders that feed into government to really continue to provide more detailed advice, because I think the biggest issue is generally the lack of understanding really around what it means to manage buildings, including in government, because the wider construction industry has obviously got a really big voice, and it's quite important for them to continue business as usual type thing. But at the same time, there is that balance to be struck with what is the best thing from a public health perspective. So we will continue to engage with those people that can make a difference in that debate on who is a critical, or more importantly, what are the critical functions. And then what we will also do is work with other stakeholders that still put out advice on a national platform to make sure that they know the important role that FMs and their workforce play in maintaining it. So, for example, using the fire safety example, I've got a call a little bit later to talk through really what best practice is in overall building management, hoping that that will feed into what the fire safety advice will end up being at national level. So I hope that answers the question, but I'm always more than happy to pick up afterwards.
No, that's great. Thank you, Sophie. And again, that there is links at the end of this presentation in terms respectively who to contact if you've got any further questions as well. John, very particularly, it was mentioned in your presentation quickly about lifts. I think you used it as an example and linked obviously to building services. And this is coming from a gentleman, Paul, thank you. I need lifts to make my building workable. What happens if the 6-month inspection is next week?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think you probably need, well, the state of your building is one consideration, but I think also the question, you need to be phoning your insurance company and finding out what the likelihood is of that visit actually taking place or not. And like I say, presumably you've still got lift maintenance going on, and there may be a source of trying to get the lift maintainer to do the thorough examination. I think it is a question of communication and seeing what resources are there and getting everything in writing, and being mindful of the fact that ultimately, as the regulatory side of things is looking less on the sites, you need to take and shoulder some of that responsibility yourself. So if the lifts are in good condition and you're reasonably happy with your maintainer, you're taking all reasonable steps, I think. But ultimately, it's up to you as to whether lifts still remain into operation or not. And I can't answer that. But you need to take all the steps and communicate with your insurance company.
Okay, thank you. We've got a last question, and it's coming from Gary, and it's for Sophie. It's the last question of the day, and any last thoughts from the speakers before we move on, because as I'm aware of time. We as FM professionals are trying to prevent something worse than COVID-19, than that being Legionella, hence the need to be a critical worker. So obviously the Legionella, obviously that's a view from one of the speakers. I guess it all further heightens the link there, Sophie, in respect to how important FMs are to buildings when they're open or closed. I guess I didn't know if you had a view on that particular point from Gary. It's more of a point than a question.
It's a very important point, and it's one that we're acutely aware of, and we're pressing with. Well, we've pressed it with ministers. We continue to press it through the different routes that we've got into those that are taking decisions on the critical list. But you're absolutely right. If this doesn't get maintained, and if water systems don't get maintained properly, we need to make sure that we try and avoid any future troubles, to put, well, not to use a catastrophe, but we are continuing to work on that. It's a question of stepping up from a public affairs point of view, that pressure. So there are other actions that we can take, including with writing to other MPs that are asking questions. There's several select committee inquiries going on in Parliament that we will be submitting information to, so that issues like that are at the forefront of those taking decisions. So thank you very much for the question. It's a really important one, and it's something we're very much aware of, and we will continue to press those points.
Thank you, Sophie. I'm so keen to squeeze one more question. I apologise, we are nearly 10 minutes over, but this is probably for John and Dave, and it's a common theme that's come through the whole host of questions. I will reiterate, these questions will be passed on to the speakers today, and we'll get back to an answer to the respective individuals. But there's a theme here, and Andrew really kicked it off with his question about what risk should we be assessing before we reopen our building. So obviously the poll today indicated a lot of business closure. So from that respect, it's interesting to understand, is there any advice we could give Andrew and others that have asked similar questions around what risk should we be assessing before we reopen our buildings? So John and Dave, is there any thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, there's a whole host. It depends on how you're structured in terms of your risk assessments going into the shutdown. But essentially, they all remain the same. So whatever services you have, whether it be water, fire, life safety, and some people even have they have building risk assessments as well to look after such things as fire exits and fire extinguishers and those sort of things, as well in a general sort of risk assessment for a building where the waste is stored and all that sort of thing. So I think you probably need to go through all your operations that you have, all the facilities operations that you have or you're responsible in your building, and work and assess exactly what the change in the property's use is going to be, and then the strategy as to how you get back. We've got time to think about this now, as to how we get back to normal, and that's one of the things I think was highlighted in some of the webinar, that we should take time to actually do that planning and take it back. So water, fire, certainly are the major ones. Dave, anything?
Yeah, quickly, I think you hit the nail on the head, John. I think assuming everybody has got good processes in place for managing the risks day to day in a normal environment, I think the starting point is to say, what have I changed in terms of the environment? And that might be about changes in occupation, things you've done to systems to cope with the short term, and look at each of those elements and just say, how has this changed the risk to my premises? And going through that in a methodical way has got to be the right way forward, given that there's a huge range of potential impacts. And as John said, and I think it's a key point, we've got some time now to think and plan for this. Use that time gainfully, get on the front foot. Don't be waiting for it to be coming about next week before you think about it.
Well, that's great. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to call time on questions. Apologies again, we have overrun. I know this section could be a webinar in its own right on the amount of questions we've got, but as promised, they will be passed on respectively to each speaker today to form an answer, and we'll respond back to that. So I want to say at this point, a massive thank you to Dave, John and Sophie for going through the webinar today, which is the first of our webinar series, just to remind people. Hopefully we stick to an hour, but it was always going to be difficult with 3 speakers and a Q&A, particularly on the topic. The website, the email address, sorry, I should say there, is the link to any further questions, and that interlinks with the COVID-19 resource page that you will find on iwfm.org.uk, which is regularly updated, which has been mentioned throughout the webinar today. Also, as a kind request from my dear self, there will be a follow-up survey on this webinar to give us some feedback about this webinar, also about what future webinars content you would like to see. So I would encourage you to fill that in, and that will help drive our series. Our next in our series will be soon announced shortly, so that will be in the next 2 weeks, obviously with the Easter break coming up, so I hope you have a lovely Easter. As well as this particular webinar recording will be housed on our website as well as our YouTube channel. So again, you can have the pleasure of looking back on it, or actually sending on to clients or colleagues that can actually make today's webinar. And lastly, of course, for the individuals that have joined this webinar, obviously through this difficult time, hopefully as the Institute and the home of FM and workplace, that we've actually given something back today on the activity that we're doing, as well as updating the resources to actually aid you through this difficult period that we're all facing at the moment. So that's enough from this webinar today. Thank you for joining us, and as I say, look out for the next in the series that will be announced shortly. Thank you again.